Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers, with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Damon. Today's episode is sponsored by the Four Bush Botanical Garden in downtown Little Rock, where everything we care about is incurably green.
And welcome back, everybody, to Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy with your host, Ben Siders. That's me. The other guy is Kirk Damon.
That's Kirk, as in the captain of the Enterprise.
We want to give a special shout-out to all of our new listeners. Kirk, we've been experimenting with Facebook campaigns, and about a month ago we did a campaign that sort of targeted geeks broadly in our region, and we got pretty good reach. You know, for a couple bucks, you hit a couple thousand people, and a pretty typical engagement rate of about 1% to 2%. But then we did a more targeted campaign that reached less than 100 people, but we got a ridiculous engagement rate of 30%. And even more crazy, the second group of people was from all over the place. We got hits from Missouri, which we expected, but also China, Japan, France, Mississippi, Montana, Russia, South Korea, Oklahoma, Haiti, Texas, Mexico City, California, Burma, and Florida.
Yeah.
Quite the spectrum.
Definitely cool. I mean, it was cool seeing sort of all the symbolic letter language names popping up and everything like that as new listeners. So.
Yeah, we wanted to say thank you to people, but we got Asian scripts where neither Kirk nor I had any idea how to pronounce the name or even how to type in.
Exactly. So we'd like to say thank you for definitely joining in and keep listening. It's cool to see you guys there.
Yeah, we also got a request. Kirk saw the Black Panther movie finally, and someone asked us if we could give our thoughts on the film. I thought we'd do that at the end of the podcast to avoid any spoilers for those of you who haven't seen it. So after we go through mail at the end, we'll give our 2-minute review of Black Panther.
I think the only spoiler I'd give ahead of time in conjunction with it is if you haven't seen it, go see it.
Yeah, go see it. If you haven't seen it, go see it. So today, and actually next time too, we're going to continue the conversation we were having about character copyright and fan fiction. And I think in today's episode, we're going to get into a little bit more detail on the Disney company's influence on our copyright laws. And while looking into this, we actually learned it's not really just Disney. It's not even primarily Disney.
I think everybody blames Disney with it.
They're an easy target. They're big. Yeah. They're still around.
It also very clearly does align with Mickey Mouse.
It does. It does. I think it's fair to say that once Disney comes to the table and says this needs to change, that's when Congress suddenly finds the motivation to do it.
Yeah.
But it's certainly not just them, and we'll get into that. And it's no mystery why it's Disney. I'd argue there's probably no content producer that's had a more profound influence on our as much cultural impact as Disney's had.
And effectively, I think you can't deny that effectively Disney created animation, at least in the form we know it today. I mean, yes, they didn't necessarily create the whole concept of it and stuff like that, but when we think of animation today, we think of stuff that was created by Walt Disney.
Yeah. So last time we talked about what character copyright is, just briefly in case you've forgotten, it's a recognition that the characters themselves can be conceived of as an expression of an underlying idea, and thus a given character may be copyrighted even if the underlying archetype is not. And the example we used of that was the mad scientist.
Yep.
So you can express this concept of a mad scientist. It's a powerful narrative element because science is actually, just before we started talking, Kirk and I were sort of discussing why is it in comics and in a lot of superhero genres, the hero is always a muscle-bound fool, lovable but muscle-bound fool.
Yes.
And the villain is always an evil genius.
Yeah, and somehow the evil genius always loses to the muscle-bound fool, even though he's an evil genius.
Yeah. So this mad scientist idea of science being the pinnacle of human intellectual achievement and yet being still perverted to the same twisted ends as anything else can be has a lot of narrative power.
Yeah, and I think it's something you commonly see in connection with the superhero narratives. A lot of times I think in many respects it falls to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I mean, we're dropping way back, all the way back to, a long time ago in conjunction with where that archetype arguably came from. But I think a lot of the reason it's such a good archetype is because what you get is you get the ability to sort of lose control.
Yeah.
And I think that's, when we're joking about it as sort of what is it, what you really see, I think a lot of times in the mad scientist is loss of control. The idea that, hey, I've created this thing, it's gone berserk. I mean, Godzilla, monster movies are the same thing,
There may be a comment embedded there on sort of the fine line between genius and insanity, too.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's that. I think also, quite frankly, there's just, when a lot of these things are created, a lot of sort of golden age of comics, stuff like that, we're talking about eras where science was scary. I mean, we're talking about the creation of the nuclear age. You
That's
know,
true.
science was scary at that point in
It
time.
still is to a lot of people. I mean, when they were starting up some of those particle accelerators, there were like legitimate articles in legitimate publications asking, are we going to open little black holes that swallow the planet?
Yeah.
And people meant that seriously.
Yeah, I mean, there was a serious discussion of it. I think most people who understood the physics said no.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of concern that science kind of go a little bit along with mysticism of the idea of, hey, if I don't understand it, it's scary. I joke about it. People who look at computers as black boxes, you know, it's this little magic machine that does things. Ultimately, it's a machine. I had to just tear my machine apart this weekend because of the fact that iTunes decided it did not wish to cooperate at all, and I had to find a way to rip it off of the machine, which I did finally do. But it's one of those where I was doing it, and it really did sort of harken home to this is just a machine. You know, I can make it do what I want it to do.
Well, so this mad scientist is the archetype. That would be the idea in the idea-expression divide. And an example of the expression of that idea would be Dr. Octopus, Dr. Frankenstein, Dr. Doom, or Dr. Moreau, to go way back. Yep. So there's a lot of ways you can kind of...
Dr. Jekyll.
Dr. Jekyll, yeah. There's a lot of ways you can express this given idea. And so those characters are protected separate and apart from any story you might tell about them. So if I go make my own Dr. Octopus comic book, I'm still infringing a copyright.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I'm going to sort of pick on the archetype as well. I'm actually going to pick on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde because let's face it, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the Hulk are the same person. I mean, Bruce Banner and the Hulk are exactly the same person.
Again, idea expression. Different ideas, same idea, different expressions of the character type.
And I think no people would deny that those are different characters, those are different expressions, but they're clearly the same archetype.
And this whole character copyright concept is a little tricky because it means that even if your expression of the idea of a character is unique and independent, it's still possible to infringe somebody else's copyright if it's too close to somebody else's character, which we talked about is sort of a trademark type issue, not really a copyright issue.
Yeah. And I think that is where we start getting into some of these difficult issues with it, is we're starting to look now, and what we went over in the last episode, and I think we're just going to follow up a little bit here as well, is the problem of character copyright is that you really start to blur trademark and copyright together. And we're seeing courts finding copyright infringements on sort of trademark concepts.
Yeah.
We're seeing that real sort of concern of exactly what this means. Now, there's good reason for it, because in many respects, these characters are valuable. Trademark is designed to connect commercial rights in some respects. I mean, as we talked about, it's really designed to protect the consumer. But it's one of those things where I think you've got some very interesting overlap, some real problems that have risen out of this. What becomes very interesting, though, is the fact that copyright and trademark are such different laws.
And meant to protect different interests, too, and promote different interests. Copyright's about promoting the creation of more cool stuff. Trademark is consumer protection, in theory.
And that's sort of, I think, the thing with it. The other thing we start looking about is, stuff like, term of protection. Trademarks have to be renewed. They have to be renewed every 10 years.
But they can last forever.
They can last forever.
As long as you take care of them.
Yeah, as long as you take care of them, so long as you continue to use it commercially. But it's one of those things that as soon as you give it up, it's gone.
Well, and trademarks also have an interesting aspect in that a lot of these characters we think about are covered by both copyright and trademark to some extent. I mean, Mickey Mouse is used as a trademark, as a designation of origin. When you see Mickey, you assume that whatever he's on is either from the Disney company or made with their approval.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, and particularly you even take the mouse ears, the basic sort of concept of the three half circles. I mean,
yeah, you think about it, a very basic trademark, but you see that, you know exactly what it is.
Yes, and so there definitely is overlap between character copyright. There is overlap between characters being trademarks, being copyrightable individuals. And the laws just seem to have real trouble with it. And I think that's the thing, is it's hard to distinguish them because they are such completely separate laws. The whole goal of copyright, the whole goal of trademark, the whole way copyrights are enforced and the whole law for enforcing it, the whole way trademarks are enforced and the law for enforcing it are almost dead opposite.
The measure of damages, how you prove your case. And what we see now is in trademark cases, they're talking about copyright principles, and in copyright cases, they're talking about trademark principles.
Yeah, and we're definitely seeing that more and more. And I think that's, it's becoming concerning where you sort of got the concern that I see, and again, this is spoken as a patent lawyer. I think one of the things that I see becoming the concern with it is we're starting to see the idea of commercial interest sneaking into copyright. And really, in many respects, copyright's supposed to be the anti-commercial interest. You go all the way back to what the purpose of copyright was. Yes, it was to protect commercial interest. But, you go to the Berne Convention, you go to some of these sort of more recent copyrights, and the whole idea is protect the independent artist. And yet what we're starting to see is a bit of follow the money.
Well, so let's go back to where this all comes from. So copyright, as you mentioned before, limited in time, but the amount of time you get a copyright for has changed a lot over the years. And are contrary to, I think, some popular perception, these IP rights are very, very old. It's among the first couple of things the first Congress did. after the Constitution was ratified is enact the Copyright Act and enact the Patent Act.
Yep.
And on top of that, both of those things are in the Constitution. But it's a little weird because if you look at the Constitution, most of the powers of Congress just say what Congress can do. Congress will have the power to raise an army or to raise a navy. Well, the copyright power is weird. Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. That's the power, to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. And we should say useful arts is a Victorian-era term that basically means technology. It's meant to be, it was at the time, it meant the opposite of the fine arts or the performing arts. But it's sort of fallen out of favor, although you still see it used like state-of-the-art. It's sort of a callback to that term. So
even Bachelor of Arts, which in many respects relates to sciences.
So, the power is to promote the progress of science and technology, but the copyright and patent clause also says how Congress is supposed to do it. They grant to authors for copyrights and inventors for patents the limited exclusive rights to their writings and inventions.
Yep.
So if you think about it, the copyright power is meant to promote the progress of science.
Yeah.
And the useful arts, which is meant to be the opposite of the fine arts. So really, nothing in that clause originally had anything to do with creative works.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting when you sort of, you again get back to that is what were we talking about. The other thing you got to remember, when the Constitution was written works meant quite literally written works.
Yeah, that's all there was.
Yeah, there's no sound recordings at this point in time. There's no movies. There's no television, anything like that. I mean, written works meant written works. It meant physically writing it with a pen and paper.
And the Copyright Act, the original act from the 1790s, it lasted 14 years.
Yep.
If you were still alive, when your first 14 years expired, you could apply for 14 more. But it didn't cover much. It covered maps and charts, both of which are arguably no longer copyrightable under some circumstances, and scientific journals and publications, and that was about it.
And a lot of that stuff, interestingly enough, is also where we talked about things in like the work for hire statute previously. Interestingly enough, a lot of the things you see in the work for hire statute is some of that original stuff associated with what you have from, protected by copyright. They talks about atlases and sort of, in many respects, an atlas being a combination of maps. Mm-hmm. You kind of can see a little bit of where maybe those specific categories came from, was the association of this is what these things are.
So it seems clear that I think originally, as written, the Patent and Copyright Acts were not, I wouldn't say they weren't intended to cover those things, but as they were written, they didn't clearly cover the fine arts or creative works.
Yep.
Nevertheless.
Now, there was some copyright state rules.
Yeah, there was a lot of state copyright at the time, and that all pretty much went away in the 1970s.
Yeah, now some of them do still around, and most of it's where you expect it. New York being one of the most important ones, just because New York being, essentially one of the existing colonies before the Constitution existed.
Yeah. But New York was also Hollywood before Hollywood was Hollywood.
Exactly.
It was the performing arts center of the world.
And so I think you've got, there's elements of the fact that there was copyright related to fine arts, but not necessarily with the constitutional copyright.
Yeah, and even as it is, there are certain things that are not covered by the Federal Copyright Act that some states will cover. But those are pretty unusual. They don't come up that much anymore.
Yep.
So this raises an interesting question. When exactly does a character copyright begin then? And we talked about this last time where, we're going to talk about Disney specifically. What do you do when a character's personality isn't established all that well, or at all even, on the original publication? So Mickey Mouse debuts in Steamboat Willie in, I think, I wrote it down here somewhere, 1923? No, 1928. 1928 is Steamboat Willie. But if you look, just go Google like Mickey Mouse over time, and you'll see that he didn't really look the way he looks now until basically Fantasia in 1940.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's I think we touched about this a little bit in our last episode, and it is one of the big problems. One of the requirements of the constitutional thing for copyright and patents, the constitutional statements, is that they're be for a limited term. Trademarks don't have to be for a limited term. As we talked about, they can last forever. What we're now bumping into in conjunction with it is when exactly does Mickey Mouse's copyright run, because who exactly is Mickey Mouse? And we talked about this. I talked about it with the M&Ms and sort of the same kind of things. Most characters undergo some form of evolution, particularly as sort of additional content is created for them. Now you look at it and you say, hey, I've got one book that was written, and has never sort of had a sequel or never had anything else written about it. Okay, you've got a definitive point in time. But, in the age of the sequel, in the age of the movie rights and things like that, which has been around for quite a long period of time, as much as
it's now very popular, the TV binge-watching serials, where you have 12 episodes released at once. Or how about The Simpsons? Something really simple that's in syndication now. 30 years of this show. And if you go back and watch first season Simpsons, the characters are virtually unrecognizable. Like, their role in the show hasn't changed, but their personalities have changed a lot.
Yeah, and that's part of that just as people get them. I mean, you talk to a lot of authors, and authors always talk about how the characters write their own stories.
Yeah.
Because they start to develop who the character is, and then the story just flows naturally from who it is. But yeah, I think you bump into that. Is when did Maggie Simpson become Maggie Simpson?
Yeah, when did they decide she's never going to actually talk, and it's just going to be like a running joke?
Yeah, and things like that. The one that I think is sort of a great example of actually that is when did Lost become Lost?
Yeah.
For anybody who watched Lost, because it's the first season of Lost and the fifth season of Lost almost have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah.
They're almost separate shows.
And you see deliberate choices made with characters. I'm a big fan of The Office and Parks and Rec. If you've seen that show, Michael Scott, Steve Carell's character in season 1, is a completely different character from the rest of the show. He starts out being this brash, rude, cruel jerk that plays really mean practical jokes on people. He's extremely unlikable. He's got this greasy hair. Some parts of his personality remain, like he thinks he's funny, but he's not. But he turns from cruel jerk into sort of a frustratingly lovable buffoon.
Yeah.
Or an Amy Poehler's character in Parks and Rec turns into the opposite in some respects. In the first season, she's this sort of pathetic underachiever, but then they kind of retool her character to become the opposite, like a really high-energy overachiever to where it becomes a running joke that her character can do, a month's worth of work by herself overnight and operate on no sleep.
Yeah, and I think that you've got some interesting things sort of in that type of thing. Unfortunately, those occur quickly. They at least occur in like one season,
over the course
so we
of
can
a
look
year.
at it and say, hey, we, for the purposes of when does it start? Well, maybe it starts a year later than when it started.
Yeah, which nobody's going to probably complain about that much.
But when you get these long-running serials and a lot of these sort of things, when does the character really come into attach? Especially when you start changing mediums. I mean, the example like I'd pick on is Harry Potter.
Yeah.
I mean, the original
When was
Harry
the first
Potter
one
book,
published? 90s?
But I want to say the 90s.
Yeah.
But I mean, when the book was first published, it was a commercial disaster. Nobody bought it. It wasn't until she changed the title and re-released it that the books became a hit. Then you sort of have the creation of the characters via the movies. And I think in many respects, a lot of fans' association with what the character is based upon the portrayals in the movies, which arguably is a different character than if you were to just read it. If we really get sort of into what is the character, let's talk about Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Where we have potentially two completely different characterizations of the same character. We don't know what's going to happen in the books, but we're approaching the end of the television series. Presumably the same things are going to happen, but we don't know if the personalities are going to stay the same. We really don't know.
So, and would the copyrights expire at a different time? Now, Game of Thrones maybe is not as big of a deal because both the books and show are being put on at the same time.
Yep.
But what do you do with something like The Wizard of Oz, where the book was published in 1900, the movie's not made for 35 years?
Yep. And I think that's the really common thing. We have a lot of that starting to happen. I mean, again, let's talk superhero movies. When you start talking about superheroes, a lot of Superman existed,
30s and 40s, somewhere in there, World War II era.
And
then you have Christopher Reeve's movie in 79, somewhere
late
70s.
Late 70s, I want to say. Or, to get into sort of really changing characters, Captain America.
Yeah.
Captain America was World War II. I mean, that's really what he was. He was a creation of World War II. And we now have him being in a modern age. I mean, there's no question that the modern Captain America movies are set in today's day and age. What is Captain America? When did this character start? Is he a World War II defender? I mean, you've got a lot of characters like that. I mean, the Punisher in some respects is like that. Watchmen.
When you
want to talk about it, I mean, Watchmen basically, is a comment from sort of, the early 80s that then was made in a movie in the 2000s.
How about Forrest Gump? I mean, the author of the Forrest Gump book hated the movie because it sanitized all of the violence and sexuality that was part of the character in the book.
Yeah.
Because wanted to make it a more family-friendly, nostalgia film, and they pulled it off brilliantly, but the author hated it for that reason.
So yeah, I think the interesting thing you really get into in conjunction with this is exactly when do these character copyrights start? It's a very difficult question because in some respects we can't define the character. And this is where when you're talking about the idea of copyright, remember we can't copyright the general archetype. So we can't say we're copywriting the mad scientist. We have to copyright Dr. Doom.
Well, to that point, we talked about this last time. What is Mickey Mouse's character?
Yeah.
Could you give me one defining characteristics of him other than what he looks like?
Yeah, you'd say in some sense he's sort of the bumbling goofball that everything turns out right for.
Yeah.
But that's Fantasia. I mean, that's not Steamboat Willie.
Yeah, sort of the accidental hero, just sort of things happen just through sheer luck.
But then you get into, I think, like, my kids watch, the standard, Disney Junior, stuff right now. And I mean, Mickey Mouse has Mickey Mouse Clubhouse on Disney Junior right now. And in that's not his character. I mean, his character is actually very intelligent. Yeah. I mean, sort of problem solver.
Well, so Steamboat Willie, at least, the copyright on that expires as of now in 2023 because under current copyright law, copyrights last for 70 years after the life of the author or 95 years for corporate authors. But this wasn't always the case. In the 1976 Copyright Act, I believe it was 56 years, something like that.
Well, the original copyright is still 14 years.
Yeah.
And I think that we need to jump back to that. It's been extended, I want to say 3 or 4 times.
Well, Mickey Mouse was created under the 1909 Act, which was a lot shorter of a copyright. And then when it was about to expire, coming up in the 1970s, they rewrote the Copyright Act and made it 40 or 50 or something years. Yep. And then when it was about to expire again in the 90s, they renewed it again in what everybody hates the most, the Sonny Bono Act, which was so named because Sonny Bono, who was very much beloved, had recently died. And so they named this act after him to be a little cynical, to disguise the fact that it was a corporate giveaway to a bunch of copyright holders who were lobbying hard for it.
It was to protect his estate. I mean, one thing was to keep his works as well under copyright to protect his estate. I mean, there is some argument for that.
Interestingly, I actually researched this when I did my law school paper. The vote on the Sonny Bono Act in Congress was taken by voice vote, which means there's no written record of who voted for it and who voted against it, which is, to me, sort of an indication that nobody wanted to have their name attached to this law because it was such a transparent exercise of power for this purpose. But Disney, I think, unfairly takes all the blame for this. It wasn't just them, though. I think to understand the context for this, what they did, when they passed the Sonny Bono Act, they extended copyright for another 19 years. At the time, works from 1922 were about to expire and enter the public domain. So once they passed the Sonny Bono Act, it gave a reprieve to everything published between basically 1922 and the early 40s.
Yep.
And this is not a coincidence. We were talking about this this morning, too, before we started recording. If you think about it, the works that were produced in America in that time period were some of the most culturally impactful works, things that kids read today. I described it as...
We're talking about the Roaring 20s.
Yeah, I described it as the bricks that form the foundation of modern Americana. And that may seem like an exaggeration, but let's think about it. You got Mickey Mouse, which, there's no question. Mickey Mouse is a pervasive cultural icon in the United States. Yep. And basically the invention of animation as an art.
And in some sense, the motion picture as well. Yeah. I mean, we have really the Hollywood movie industry starting to come into its own.
We also made a list of some other things. So this morning we had a friend of ours, Mike, stop by to talk to us this morning, and we were kind of explaining the podcast today, and I told him, can you name 3 books published in the 1910s? And he couldn't.
Yeah,
I mean, those of you who are book nerds probably could, but I couldn't. Yeah. I looked some up and recognized some names, but most of what I saw, I didn't recognize. How about the 1920s? Well, yeah, you got Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, James Joyce, Sinclair Lewis, William Faulkner, T.S. Eliot, Agatha Christie, Langston Hughes, Virginia Woolf. You've got the Harlem Renaissance. There are so many writers that came into their own in the 1920s, and so much that was published.
American writers. These are American writers.
Yeah, James Joyce is Irish, but still, the point is you've got a lot of these important works. Steinbeck. Is another one. Gone with the Wind, Margaret Mitchell was in this time period. The Wizard of Oz movie was made in this time period, and it's not just film and I guess television is probably premature, but music and plays as well. We were talking about Rodgers and Hammerstein, and Gershwin, Rhapsody in Blue.
Well, I think you've also got, when you start thinking the 20s, you're starting to think like really American music also starting to come into play.
It's mass media, right? The invention of the broadcast medium and the ability to reach a wider audience beyond just who can show up and see a performance.
But also a lot of American styles, I think you could also say, are potentially coming into play in the 20s. Jazz, blues, ragtime. Now, I mean, people who are seriously into music are going to dispute exactly when these things come into play.
The origins of these things can be laid elsewhere, but we're talking about when it became popularized and commercialized and really brought into the American cultural conscience. So you have defining works come from this era and things that we make our children watch because if you haven't seen it, you can't understand America. Are all in this time period. So without the Sonny Bono Act, all of this stuff would have been in the public domain 20 years ago. It would all be out there right now. So these extensions kind of make sense economically when you think about from the perspective of the rights holders. But this comes at a cost. And I got a quote here from a Duke law professor whose name I forgot to write down, but I found him on Twitter. He says, we are, quote, the first generation to deny our own culture to ourselves, end quote, because, quote, no work created during your lifetime will, without conscious action by its creator, become available for you to build upon, end quote. What do you think of that, Kurt?
I think that's a really interesting statement. I think you can take some issues with a few things in it because obviously we can build upon it.
Yeah.
We can treat it as an archetype. But I think his real statement, I think it's a very important statement, is there is nothing created that we can recall being created, which we are allowed to copy.
Yeah. He's saying nobody else, during our lifetimes, nobody's going to tell a Star Wars story without Disney's permission.
Yeah. And that's a sort of important thing to keep in mind. We can tell, the sequel to Hamlet.
Yeah.
That's long gone from copyright, those types of things.
Never was copyrighted.
Never was copyrighted, arguably, yes. But the things that I think you really get into, and I think that quote really sort of hits home upon it, is this does come at a cost. We have granted these artists this right to protect their stuff, but it comes at a cost. And that cost is something where we're starting to, I think, see some concerns in conjunction with the copyright law. Where is the copyright law going? Of what does this mean when we say we can't build upon it? What does it mean? I mentioned music, and I'm just going to talk about it. We talked about this a little bit ahead of time in conjunction with it. For those of you who are aware, the blurred lines verdict was just upheld by the appeals court back on March 21st. That's what we're talking about because one of the right here, because when we talked about the idea of musical styles, there's an argument that the blurred line verdict basically says that Marvin Gaye copyrighted a style. And
which sounds like a trademark issue.
Which sounds like a trademark issue. But we get into those types of questions where we're now saying, if we're going to allow people to copyright styles, we're going to allow people to not build upon it, to basically say, hey, this thing existed, and what you've done is a copyright infringement because you were influenced by it. There's a lot of people talking about that this appeal verdict is devastating. I think, to be quite truthful, the appeal is not that important. I mean, what the appeal court was finding, and anybody who knows anything about law—
they're just reviewing issues of law,
yeah,
not
they're
fact.
reviewing specific issues. What you're really talking about is whether or not the district court opinion is problematic. But the things you get into with this is now we're looking at it and saying, are artists in the point where it's, hey, we've granted so many rights to somebody for creating something original that we've literally killed off originality. And wait a minute, isn't the point to promote the progress of these things? Isn't that the point of the Constitution?
And you have to argue, so with the Sonny Bono Act, they add 19 years of extension on. Is there anybody who was not going to create something that says, oh, well, I guess if it's going to last for another 20 years after I die, now I care enough to sit down and write? It's a pretty dubious proposition.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, is it's the problem you get into when you talk about 100 years, you're talking about lives of corporations.
Yeah.
You're really not talking about people's lives anymore.
We said last time, follow the money, and that's the thing. As the amount of money, as your ability to sell grows, as the size of markets grows, the value of a copyright increases massively.
Yep.
So if you compare, what was Shakespeare's audience for his works? Unquestionably, in my opinion, the greatest English language publisher, writer, author ever, right?
Yeah. I think most people, there's some disagreement, but I don't think you can deny he's definitely one of the top 5.
Yeah. How much money did he make?
Yeah.
Not that much. Who, first of all, he couldn't publish anything. We didn't have printing presses. Well, we kind of did, but his main audience was people going to plays. And his work was considered lowbrow at the time.
Yeah, now it sold well.
Yeah, it sold well.
It was popular.
It was mass market schlock for his day.
I mean, he was the Dragonlance writer of his day. I mean,
yeah, exactly. So but what was his market? Relatively small. How much money could he make? Not that much. Compared to J.K. Rowling, what's her market? It's the entire world.
Yeah,
it has a lot more people in it now, and it's cheaper to make her stuff. It's cheaper to distribute it.
I mean, arguably his market was Stratford-on-Avon and maybe a little bit larger.
Yeah. Could he sell into France? Maybe. Could he sell into Russia? No. Japan? No.
Yeah.
The New World? No. What about J.K. Rowling? Where can she not sell? Nowhere. You can read her stuff on the space station if you want.
Yeah, and I think people have.
Probably have, yeah. So, but on the flip side, the artists who are arguing for this, and this is not just Disney, this was Hammerstein's estate, the Gershwin estate, they all lobbied hard for this extension too. And they correctly pointed out that the U.S. was actually kind of unusual. We had an unusually short copyright duration compared to the rest of the world, and most notably to Europe. And under European law at the time, the duration that the EU would recognize the U.S. copyright in the EU was based on U.S. law. So in the EU, their people got longer copyrights than ours, and our copyrights were shortened in Europe because our law was behind. Yep. And so our creative artists and people like that all said, we need to catch up and harmonize our law with theirs because right now we're at a competitive disadvantage.
Yeah, and there's a lot of interesting stuff, I think, in harmonization and the idea of how do you deal with these things across countries. Because you really do bump into this fact of, when you start getting to a global market. When originally we didn't have a global market, it wasn't an issue. We talked about Shakespeare not having a global market. When we get into a global market, you have this issue of what happens when it's different in one country than another. We've seen this modern day. I mean, anybody who remembers it when MP3s first came out, Russia has different copyright protections for music than the United States did. And so effectively, Russia argued that digital downloads were equivalent to importing individual copies for personal use. It was subject to customs laws. There was some grounds to that, the idea that copyright was different. So basically, you could obtain work in Russia and bring it to the United States that you couldn't obtain in the United States.
That's an important point because IP rights are all territorial. They're all based on the government that grants them and recognizes them. So if you get a copyright in the U.S., you only have a copyright in Canada as well if Canadian law will recognize your U.S. copyright. Well, there's no obligation outside of treaties for any given country to do that. So when you have these small nations that are not part of these treaties or new nations are formed that aren't signed up to them, your copyrights are basically no good there. It's a free-for-all.
Yeah. And I think the other thing you also bump into, and I think to keep in mind when we're talking about these, in many respects, while we look at it and say the harmonization is necessary to do this, and I'll just tell you just generally, me sort of politically, I'm not a big fan of harmonization, particularly with IP laws and using that as a justification for IP laws. But one of the things I think is very interesting is if you go back before the United States had this in sort of early United States, the United States didn't recognize European copyright.
Which was a big deal because people kept ripping off all of Charles Dickens' works.
Yes, in the United States.
Which made him very mad.
And you could actually make false copies of it. And actually, I remember I read a book a little while ago. It's called Copyright and Copy Wrong, which is actually a great book if anybody wants to read it. One of the things it talks about is that Mark Twain's original job, before he became Mark Twain, and part of how he learned to write was copying British copyrights, copyrighted works, and European copyrighted works. That's how he learned to write. So you kind of look at it and say, hey, one of America's greatest authors learned to write by being a copyright infringer. There's a lot of argument that the reason, if you take a look at the very first motion picture made, it filmed a play. That's a copyright infringement, unquestionably.
Yeah, you can't do that. Well, and on top of that, believe it or not, the U.S. isn't even the longest-lived copyright in the world. Yeah. I think that honor belongs to Mexico. Yeah, which if you understand Mexico's history, it sort of makes sense. Mexico, before NAFTA, had a very, very robust film industry of its own. Yep. And a lot of their best, most talented people have now come to the U.S. Guillermo del Toro, I can't pronounce his name right. A lot of those kind of creative minds are now in Hollywood and doing work here. But the Mexican film industry also lobbied hard there. And I think theirs lasts 120, 140 years. It's crazy.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how long it is. I know it is long.
Also interesting side note I discovered while looking into this, the main opponent to the Sonny Bono Act was the hospitality industry because they were tired of paying exorbitant licensing fees for music.
Which is interesting, actually, because it is. I mean, you got a lot of these things where it's sort of, there's copyright licenses that fall into play in a lot of places, and people don't realize it. I mean, when you're listening to music in an elevator, there's a copyright license.
Public performance license. That's different from, you can't just buy a CD and play it in your elevator or your restaurant. It's a public performance. You need a different set of rights than what you get with the CD.
Yeah, because that's for private performance. I mean, we've all seen those disclaimers. I mean, anybody who watched sports last weekend has all seen disclaimers. This is it's a presentation of insert, organization, license for private performance. That's the thing sort of you bump into with it.
Well, that also became it's not to sidetrack us too much, but there was an issue for a while with Super Bowl parties, where at what point is your Super Bowl party big enough with an open invite and a big TV to where it's effectively a public performance, not a private, viewing, and so you actually need public performance rights, which are much more expensive.
Yeah, and there's a lot of weird questions that revolve around that kind of stuff. And I think, again, one of the things that I think for me looking at this, and an important thing I think you bump into this is we've created a beast when it comes to copyright. And there's a lot of argument that this beast is necessary. There's a lot of argument that this beast is a good thing. There's also a lot of argument that this beast is a bad thing. But one of the things I think to really keep in mind is it is a beast. This is something which is hard to understand. This is something which is difficult for the average person to be able to, comprehend, much less abide by.
There's a lot of moving parts in this, and a lot of our copyright policies and laws have historical antecedents that we've scratched the most basic surface in. We've been going 30 minutes now. We've barely covered the simplest elements of just the Sonny Bono Act and the politics and the commercial influences behind that. But the point is that these long copyrights, although they serve commercial interests that employ people and that make businesses run, they have consequences. They do inhibit us from using, say, Mickey Mouse to make something new. I personally am a little skeptical about how damaging that is. To me, what's more creative, a wholly new original work or just making a new work with somebody else's character? I'd rather see something original. now. What do we see now? We see in Hollywood just endless churning out of sequel after sequel after sequel. Everybody complains about it. Well, that's all based on these copyright interests, and nothing stops somebody who wants to be creative and do something new and different from doing that. The problem is not so much to me the copyright, it's that finding an audience for new original works is a lot harder than it was before.
But then you kind of bump into the extent we say, hey, this is audience, this is recognition of it being the same thing. That's trademark.
Yeah.
And we're back to where we started again of, why do we have copyright in this space? If the idea is, hey, we don't want other people making Mickey Mouse movies, can't we cover that effectively with trademark?
Which I think is what's going to happen, right? Because Mickey Mouse is undoubtedly a trademark. Just because, Steamboat Willie's copyright expires, let's play that out. Does that mean that the Mickey Mouse copyright expires? Even if it does, and we'll talk about this more in our next episode, even if it does, there's still a trademark interest in Mickey Mouse. It's not like just because the copyright's gone that now anybody can go out and make a Mickey Mouse plush toy.
Yep. And that's where I think you bump into it is what is Mickey Mouse in Steamboat Willie? And that's kind of where we started this, as to when do we say when does a copyright start, a character copyright start? We also have then the question of what exactly is a character copyright in? Mm-hmm. And I think we can look at it and say, if Steamboat Willie's copyright runs, and eventually it must run.
Yeah.
I mean, it has to be for a limited time. That's the definition of the Constitution. It must
and I don't
run
think it's going to get extended again. There's been no rumblings about that. I can't see it happening.
Yeah,
I think Disney's got a contingency plan in place that's probably going to work, which is if you've seen, if you watch Disney movies in the 90s, what happened when the movie started? You saw the Cinderella Castle and the music, and now you see an 8-second clip of Steamboat Willie because they're trying to get a copy or a trademark interest, which will last forever in the movie.
Well, at least in that portion of the movie.
At least that portion of the movie.
And I think the thing that you really get into is assuming that it does run, the one thing you presumably can do is there is no copyright in Steamboat Willie itself anymore.
Right.
In the actual movie as we see it.
So other people can, put a DVD of it out, make a copy, and distribute it.
Yeah, potentially. Again, you bump into the potential trademark interest.
Yeah, they'll say you'll be confused
like
about where it came from. You can deal with that by just putting on the box, not from Disney Company.
But I think the thing that you really get into when you're starting to talk a lot about those kind of issues that are now getting into with the sort of trademark versus copyright, where do we get with Steamboat Willie being Mickey Mouse in Steamboat Willie? Mm-hmm. And does that mean I can use the same black and white representation of him, but I can present it in an entirely new story? Or is that the same
Or can
Mickey
I use
Mouse?
the current look of Mickey Mouse?
Yeah.
Or do I have to wait for those copyrights to expire? Because it is a different visual depiction, even setting apart the character's personality.
And I think the real key thing with it is he's black and white. And I think that's one of the key components of it is, can I now present Mickey Mouse in black and white without an infringement of copyright, but I can't present him in color? When we say what does the character copyright start is the first question, but the second question is when does it end and what is it? And we're now looking at it and saying, okay, our problem with copyright is we don't know when the copyright starts, when it ends, or what it covers. Now we start looking at this as a law point and say, well, wait a minute, what's the law?
I think we'll start getting answers in the next 5 years. I think this copyright is going to expire. Somebody's going to put the test case out there. Disney's going to litigate it.
Yep.
And within 5-6 years, we're going to see the first lawsuit trying to enforce a trademark interest in Steamboat Willie. And we'll see where it goes.
I think we also see enforcing copyright interest, quite frankly, though.
Probably. They'll at least attempt to argue that the Mickey Mouse copyright has not yet run based on, say, Fantasia or some later publication. And I think we'll get some clarity on this point. And it's going to be really interesting to watch. And if we're still doing this podcast, we'll do one on that one.
Well, and I think the real value of this is, as much as you can say sort of it's Disney has the problem of being a corporate interest in doing this, Disney can afford to be that test case.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. I mean, we will have extremely good lawyers, with lots of research.
Disney can't win this battle. Nobody can.
Yeah. But it's even if they don't win it, I don't think it matters. I think the key of what we get into with it is it will be very, very thoroughly considered.
Yes.
And that's a good thing.
It will go to the Supreme Court, most likely, unless they deny certiorari.
Yeah. And that's a good thing from this because we'll have two litigants in conjunction with this who have the ability to actually decide this. And that's, if nothing else, that's the good thing.
It should bring some certainty to this body of law.
Yeah.
And that will help other people plan what to do with these properties going forward. It will probably also influence the lobbying efforts that take place from, say, 1920 or 2024 on. So we'll see that too. All right, well, we're going to move on here. So our takeaways, I don't think, Kirk, neither one of us would deny that Disney's had a profound influence on our copyright laws. But it's not just them. It's others, too. People who are probably have a little more innocuous perception in the public eye, like Rodgers and Hammerstein and Gershwin and people like that.
And some of it we can also say, I think, is while it may be Disney, it may also be the era. And I think that's an important thing.
I think it's an
point
important
out.
thing. That particular era was a crucial formative period of the nation. And, and I'd argue that if that hadn't been the era, if it was instead the 1960s, then nobody would be caring about copyright extensions until that period expired. Nobody cared about stuff from the 1910s going into the public domain because who can name anything, you know?
Yeah, you've got to wonder if stuff's going to come out sort of if the next important period is going to be when things post-World War II become important. That may be the next important period of sort of American history. You know, you're talking the 50s. Is that when we're going to become suddenly interested again?
Yep. And will there be any more extensions? I think probably not.
I mean, I'd be willing to predict. We saw how well our predictions worked in conjunction with Star Wars, but you know, I predict that I don't think there's really going to be any more extensions. And part of the reason I don't think there's going to be more extensions is because the extension's already beyond the lifetime. As the sort of Duke Law professor that you quoted said, you know, we're already so far along.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we need to make it any longer.
I mean, there's no harmonization arguments to make unless we want to harmonize with Mexico, but that, you know, doesn't make any sense.
That doesn't make any sense, yeah.
I don't see what the cover is going to be for trying to do it again unless Europe gets on board, and I don't think they're interested. So I think we're going to get answers soon. Okay, well, we have mail. Here we go. We heard from somebody on ISCA, or I did, that you may remember in a couple episodes ago I mentioned the Great Iowa Treasure Hunt, which had to do with Charlotte was on talking about achievement. Somebody else from Iowa checked the website, and the state owed them money. So they let me know that they're getting like $12 from the state of Iowa.
Which is really kind of awesome, actually.
Yeah, so no finder's fee. You're welcome. We also have a Well Actually guy that corrected several episodes ago. We were talking about the Kobold Librarian in Hearthstone and how it works.
Yep.
And we both thought it wasn't working the way that the text was written, but our Well Actually guy corrected me and said it's actually an animation ordering problem, and the card text is accurate to describe the interaction.
And when you look at it, he is correct.
And we checked, he's right, we're wrong, so there you go. Another Well Actually guy, this is way back from our Star Wars Holiday Edition, Holiday Special episode, I think me or Kirk, one of us mentioned something about Fox channels not being widely available in the 80s.
Yeah.
He said that's true because they weren't available at all. Fox didn't come out until later. So this is just what happens when you're doing a podcast and you think of something and you don't have time to fact check everything. So, and someone said, did you follow Dennis Crouch? He did a story on science fiction law regarding Minority Report and predictive policing. Dennis is a patent professor at Mizzou.
University of Missouri, Columbia, for those of you who aren't local.
I've met him once or twice. Have you met Dennis, haven't you?
Oh, yeah, I met Dennis.
Yeah, Dennis is great.
Guy.
I did see that. Kirk, you probably did too. We both subscribed to Dennis's mailing list. It's an interesting story. We'll have to look into that in more detail. And talk about it. And then the last one, someone asked us to do a Black Panther review. Kirk, go ahead. You've seen it more recently.
So yeah, I saw it. What's a few weeks ago now. By the time this podcast will release, I loved it. I am not a big fan of superhero movies for the most part. The problem with this is I find a lot of them to be formulaic, and I find a lot of the heroes to be kind of dull. While I think the hero in Black Panther is a bit formulaic as to what it is, the background is not. And I think that's the reason I really enjoyed the movie. It was a very sort of well set up, well arranged thing. What I really liked about it, and I comment about this, and I'll make the prediction right now as to what it is. If the costumer for Black Panther does not win the Oscar, there is something very, very wrong in the world. The costuming in that is just brilliant. The set design is just brilliant. And that's what makes it so cool as a movie, is it's set in a world that I think it's fantastic, but it's set within a world which is also fantastic. We've had superhero movies, but we created this new world within it, which is very African, which is the creation of the idea of, what do we have coming out of the Black Panther mythos and the idea of this sort of secret society, community basically that exists. And they did a great job of basically saying this is it in a very it's a modern world, but it's even a beyond modern world. Because in many respects, as much as we say superheroes are set in modern world, they're really set in a beyond modern world.
Conceptually, the idea behind the story I found fascinating. We're going to take these Central African cultures that by any modern standard remain somewhat primitive. They've industrialized slowly, much like a lot of Asia has, and we're going to take those cultures and say, but what if? What if they industrialized the way that Europe did, for example? What would you get? And what would this culture look like? And it looks so different from European culture. It was just, I'm just watching the movie. I didn't even care what happened. I was just watching the visuals. It was just so interesting. I wish they'd slow down the pacing even more so I could just soak in the scenes and just look at it. It was a really neat looking movie.
That was my real take of it as well. Is it's so much to me with that movie was much more setting than characters. I mean, the characters are fascinating. I do sort of agree that I think that the two women, quite frankly, steal the show from Black Panther. But I think that the characters are well set up. They're well laid out. But the setting is so cool. I also like the fact that it's when you have the CIA agent who sort of comes into there. it's completely alien to him, and it's alien to you, and they present it that way, where it's suddenly he comes up and he's like, wait a minute, you can't do that. Like, what do you mean we can't do that? Of course we can do that.
I love how all the characters were like slightly exasperated with him having to get caught up with where they are.
Yes. Like, I mean, my favorite line of the thing, you mentioned this earlier, is, wait, you have hover bikes?
Yeah, like, of course we do.
You know?
I think what I liked the best about it, I think, was most of the superhero movies have a structural problem. The origin story part is interesting, which is always the first third of the movie. And then you get the second third, which is the villain's origin and setting up the conflict. And then you have the big dumb fight at the end.
Yeah.
And the big dumb fight to me is always the boring part, where it's like, okay, I know we have the great CGI and the action scenes, but I know how this ends. The good guy is going to win. The bad guy is going to lose. It's just a matter of how we get from A to B. And it's usually a lot of hard-to-follow frenetic action. Maybe I'm just getting too old for this. And Black Panther had a little bit of that at the end with the, I thought, unnecessary fighting rhinoceroses scene. And that kind
I
of
liked
stuff.
the fighting rhinoceroses.
Well, it was fine, but the parts of the story I liked the best were the character development parts, where they were establishing the setting and establishing Wakanda and establishing the rites of succession and the vision they have when they bury the characters, and then he goes into like the spirit world and talks to his ancestors, and just all of the sort of world building and culture building and environment building aspects I thought were really interesting. And there's also not really an origin story. He already has the costume. We don't have to find out where it comes from. And we do find out, but it's not really a part of the story. He's already this person. We don't watch him become it. He already is.
Yeah, he sort of becomes it formally.
Yeah, I mean, that's all part of the political aspects. And the conflict was not evil genius with a laser into the sky that's going to turn us all into lizards or something. Yeah. It was a political dispute within Wakanda about what to do with these resources and how best to use them. And like Michael B. Jordan's character, what was his name? Killmonger. He had a point, like look, we could be doing more. Now, he went too far with what he wanted to do, but I liked at the end, what's his name? T'Challa? I don't know, is that right? Yeah.
I think it's right.
The king, Black Panther. Killmonger wasn't wrong. And they came around to his point of view. They wanted to use their resources differently, but they agreed that he was right. They needed to share what they had with the world and improve things.
Or at least right to some respects.
I liked that the story was smaller. It was more tightly focused, and it wasn't this big epic where we had to save the city from being destroyed. It was more about saving a people from being destroyed.
Yeah, and the one thing I also have to admit, and we talked a little bit about this, but one of my favorite scenes actually in the movie, quite frankly, I actually really enjoyed the sort of succession battle and the idea of the kings fighting each other. And I liked the way they did it. I thought it was really cool with the idea of sort of collapsing circle, which to me felt very Roman. I mean, to be quite truthful, I have no idea if there's any association with that I should be making, but that was one of the things that I had with it.
I didn't put that together, but yeah.
But the shield wall, that's sort of what I was kept thinking of. But I think one of the things that I really liked about it is you do that in the first one. You have this combat where he fights the opposing king, and you very much have this thing at the end of the yield, your people need you. The idea that this is a combat which has to take place, but in some sense the outcome's a foregone conclusion. Then you have Killmonger showing up and entering this, and it ends, I think everybody's essentially horrified by how it ends, but part of the reason is you get the impression that nobody's ever died before.
Yeah, they don't actually finish anybody off that way.
Yeah, right? And it's an important thing that aspect be there, that there be the threat of this, but that it never really happens because there was a sort of recognition in the community that no, these people are necessary, that you shouldn't just kill off an opposing king because they oppose your power. You can defeat them, and there's nothing ignoble about the defeat even. That's acceptable, you tried, and simply that's the way it is. And I actually really like that. And I really like the way the actors portrayed it. I like the way it was done. The way it's done is this kind of, hey, wait, this is the process. And the way I had it is it was sort of a process over substance. And I guess part of that was what appealed to me as the lawyer, where it was hey, they have this process in place, and suddenly this process is used by a party that they didn't expect in a way they didn't expect. And it creates this enormous problem.
And they have a debate internally, too. Like, well, this is the way that we do things, and he's the correct king according to our laws. Yeah. And so the soldiers, they think they need to follow him, even though they don't like it. Yeah. Which I wish they'd explored that concept more of the sort of like what does it mean to be a legitimate governor or not? They're all looking at it and saying, this is not right. This is not the direction for Wakanda. This is not the people that we are. This person's been shaped by a cultural experience of growing up as a minority in America, and so his view on what we should be doing is a little different from how we view our own role. It was a really interesting cultural tension that they solve with a big dumb fight at the end.
Well, the other thing that I think they did really well with it is after he becomes the king, the ability to destroy the ability for there to be future kings, and the idea that he essentially essentially comes with absolute power.
That's right, because he destroyed all the flowers.
He destroys the flowers. And I think I really enjoyed that tension. It's something that I don't think has ever really been explored in a superhero movie. The idea that says, should a superhero have the ability to destroy, the ability to make superheroes? Interesting enough, the only other one I can really talk about that I think touched on it as all is some of the Wolverine movies. Some of the X-Men movies. Deadpool actually touches on it a little bit, of this idea of what does it mean to make superheroes. And it's something I think the X-Men played around with a bit just because of the nature of the X-Men. But it's one of those where I really liked that portion of it. The idea that, somehow this has been damaged, but it's been damaged entirely by the rules. And again, that kind of appealed to the lawyer in me of this is the concern with black letter law. This was following black letter law, and suddenly it creates all these problems.
Well, overall, I liked it. I found it refreshing. I found it to be a different kind of comic book hero movie. And I agree with a lot of the reviews that said this is a movie we needed to have on so many levels, both like a social level as well as a narrative level, where I'm tired of the same superhero movies over and over and over. And this was just different in so many ways and all good ways.
I am really curious what his character is going to be like in Infinity War.
Yeah, me too. Okay, so we went over 2 minutes there, but that was a great film, fun to talk about. Okay, so there's the music, and it is time to go. If you have questions, comments, topic ideas, or just want to hear your name read, you can send your thoughts to us on Twitter at LGGpod or email us at lggpodcast@gmail.com. You can also talk to us on our Facebook page, search for Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, and you will find us there. You can subscribe to this podcast. Find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Podbean, wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, please give us a review. We appreciate that. It helps other people find us. You can find me on Twitter at Benjamin Siders, and Kirk is at KirkDMN. Next time, we're going to do the third part of our character copyright series, where we're going to go through a series of sort of specific cases, and now that we've laid the groundwork for this, kind of talk through how courts have actually decided these things, which will give you probably the best guidance you can get on where these lines are drawn. So that's all for today. We'll see you next time. Lorem, play us out.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded at Cool Fire Studios in St. Louis, Missouri.